Hello. So, long time no see. My bad. I took a little break for two reasons. One, it is a assessment season in college and I am swarmed. But I passed two so far, waiting on hearing back from another one, and I've still got a psychology assessment to do next week, which I haven't studied for. So, number two, I never expected my last video to get the views that it did. I only started my channel like 2 months ago, and it is very unheard of for channels that new to get that amount of views. And I was not prepared for the barrage of hate that comes with that. And I did the one thing that people say not to do. I looked at the ATF forum post that was made about me. But if you don't know what that is, I recommend looking at my last video. I wouldn't look that up yourself. Someone made a comment saying how I was wearing like 5 pounds of makeup to not even look like a 5 out of 10. Like, yeah, because I don't look like a 5-year-old. Because you're a predator. Like, that might have hurt my feelings if it was posted elsewhere. But sorry, I'm not a child, I guess. But I was on that website for more than just to look at posts about me. Not to be a nonce. Before anyone starts that, I found a post from someone who claimed to be a MAP ally, and they went on a whole spiel about supposed studies which question the harm that adult-child relationships actually cause. So I was like, let me look at that. I looked at their first cited source and realised that they didn't even take the time to read the study, and realised that there was no point in looking at the other ones because they clearly didn't know what they were talking about and are wrong. Which leads us on to the topic of today's video, which I guess you can garner from the title. I've been getting a lot of comments from people being like, but there's no real children being harmed. Who's this hurting? No one? So we're going to disprove them today. But as usual, I will be talking about pretty disturbing content today, such as paedophilia, CSAM, distribution of images, stuff like that. I won't be going into things in graphic detail, but there still will be mentions. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, that's so fine. Please don't make yourself watch this video. I will be leaving resources in the description if you feel like you've been affected by any of these topics. I'm more so going to be talking about legal matters and studies done surrounding lolicon. I will be showing someone dressing up as a child who is not a child. I will also be discussing a pretty disturbing manga, but I'm not showing anything. So if you think that you want to stick around, please do, but also don't harm yourself in doing so. This topic sort of sparked in my mind when a couple weeks ago I was doing my little morning scroll on Twitter with my cup of tea, like it's the newspaper, and I came across this post which was discussing a woman named Zhao Mao, who is a fully grown woman, which we know she is because she has a Gank Now account, which if you don't know what that is, it's basically akin to like OF or Patreon. So we know she's a fully grown woman because she has that account, which we'll get into. She uses clothing and filters to appear like a child. And she does this to promote her Gank Now account. Gank Now, like I said, it works similar to OF or Patreon, where you can pay to unlock videos or pictures. She also has a membership option where you can pay to DM with her. I wonder who's paying for that. Going off of her Instagram account, the earliest post seems to be from August of last year. She does have a TikTok account as well, but I don't know if like there was content made before that and it's been archived, but that's the earliest public post. From the looks of things, she grew pretty fast and is still posting regularly, with the most recent post being from 2 days ago, which at a first glance there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But then we get to the video of her dressed in a Japanese child swimsuit. There's also ones with various other children's clothing items. As I was scrolling through these posts, I came across this video. It had like a hashtag like cosplay, and I went to the comments and someone commented, oh, does no one recognize like who she's cosplaying? And I was like, no. And then I scrolled to another video with the same cosplay, and the top comment was Onichichi, and I had the unfortunate job of googling what this was. I've already mentioned trigger warnings, but trigger warning, it is a hentai about a young child who is assaulted by her stepdad and drugged and she's cosplaying as that young girl. But I think that just sums up the audience that she has, and she clearly knows what the fuck she's doing. Originally, this was all this video was going to be, discussing her content, her different posts, and the harm she's doing, but a lot of people don't know the actual harm that this creates, or they're ignorant to it, or they're the ones consuming this media who have made themselves way too home in my comment section and DMs. So, I thought I would do some research into lolicon history and actually find studies that prove how harmful this is and not just go off hearsay, which it feels like common knowledge, but for some it's not. I know I'm gonna get a shit ton of hate for this, as usual, but I don't understand how that, not to sound like I'm a fucking right-wing nutjob, I'm not putting that out there, I'm not a Tory. However, sometimes I feel like people go so far left-wing that they turn right-wing, because why is it now a controversial thing to say that paedophilia is bad, and that if you're engaging with this content, you're a weirdo? Why is that debatable now? And no, I'm not going to call you a map. You're not the same as like the LGBTQ community. You're not the same. At one point, I did have sympathy for the P words. However, if you're not actively getting help and trying to help yourself, you know, in therapy, and instead you're engaging in these online forums saying that you want a P word partner in discussing, do you know what, I'm not even going to get into it right now. I have no sympathy for you. None. I don't. And if you're in my comments trying to gain sympathy from me, you're not going to get it unless you're trying to get help. And you're not engaging in online communities to do with it. Anyway, with that out of the way, to start, I thought I'd look at the history of the term loli and where that actually came from. And it stems from the novel Lolita, which is such a misunderstood book in my opinion, and I very much recommend that you give it a read, but look up trigger warnings first. It follows a P word as he grooms a child, and it is very disturbing. And a lot of people get the wrong idea that it's romanticizing the situation. It is not. The book does not romanticize it. That's the point. You're meant to feel disgusting when you're reading it. If you do want to give it a read, the author himself has asked that book publishers don't add an image of a girl on the cover, but book publishers don't listen. And there are many that do depict that. So if you're able to find like a more plain cover, that's probably best. Lolicon culture wouldn't really make a rise until 1982, where a animation company by the name of Ashe Productions released an anime under the name of Magical Princess Minky Moo, which is such a cute name. I love it. But if you've watched any like magical girl anime like Sailor Moon, it's pretty much a similar concept. It's about a young girl who is sent to Earth in order to spread hope to people. It's very cute. There's nothing harmful with the show itself. It's a very nice little show for young girls. However, like another animation targeted towards young girls, it brought in a different kind of audience with older males. Even one of the people associated with working on the show described these older males' activities as disturbing. And I'm not going to get into what those activities were. However, with an elder male fan base and a show about a young girl, I'm sure you can piece that together yourself. But they did help the show get more episodes than it was meant to. So, yay. Stemming from this rise in popularity came the lolicon genre, which is attributed to the Lolita complex, which is the attraction to underage girls. In manga, these are usually like standalone short chapters with like minimal to no plot, which sort of leads to the inevitable and direct advance towards sexual content, which sort of mirrors like adult pornographic material. Things such as coercion, rape, bondage, rape myth, incest are really common elements in these. And the age is often left quite ambiguous. Sometimes you can't tell if they're a child or in high school, but also it's not unheard of for there to be a given age. Why did this genre actually grow in popularity so much? I found an academic poster made by the University of Oregon who would accumulate this popularity to Japan's sort of obsession with youth and innocence as a beauty standard. You know, it's this very pale white, petite, hairless girl, which only sends a message to young girls that they're just objects for consumer consumption, as well as that their youth and innocence is desired in a sexual way? And the other answer is pedophiles. On March 10th, 2006, Dwight Horley was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison on child pornography charges. Horley had a history of receiving and sending child pornography via email and had previously served time in federal prisons for these offences. He was also convicted, among other charges, of using a public computer at a Virginia Employment Commission office on March 30th, 2004 to receive 20 Japanese cartoons that showed seemingly minor females engaged in sexual intercourse with males seemingly older than 18. This part of his conviction and his sentencing was based on his violation of the 2003 Protect Act. His appeal to reverse his conviction was denied by the courts. On May of 2006, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement confiscated a package mailed from Japan to Christopher Handley, a comic book collector in Glendon, Iowa. The package contained Japanese comic books that had cartoon visualizations of seemingly minor females engaged in sex with older males and animals. The US Postal Inspection Services served a search warrant on Handley and subsequently found and seized from his home other drawings of children engaged in acts that they concluded was sexual abuse. Handley was convicted, as Dwight Horley was, on violations of the 2003 Protect Act, and his appeal for dismissal was denied. On February 13, 2010, Christopher Handley, who had no criminal history, was formally sentenced to 6 months in prison for importing and possessing 7 Japanese comic books depicting cartoon children having sex. Books Handley bought were available through the Japanese Amazon website. When we're discussing the legality behind these things, we have to make it clear that obscenity and pornography mean two different things in a law setting. Legally, pornography is defined as materials such as books, films, magazines, things like that, which have the sole intent of causing arousal. However, obscenity refers to things that are apparent and have little to no serious literary, artistic, or scientific value. Both definitions do involve a sexual aspect, as obscenity was expanded to include social values. The major difference between these two words, though, is the protection they receive under the First Amendment and Constitution of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States held that materials considered pornographic, including their creation, sales, and advertisement and distribution, constitute speech protected by the First Amendment and cannot be prosecuted as a crime. Obscene materials, or obscenity in general, is not protected speech and can be severely regulated by the government or even banned as a violation of criminal law. Purveyors of obscene material, by creating, selling, advertising, distributing, and otherwise making them available, can suffer fines and imprisonment. However, the area of child pornography, which I don't want to call it that, I'm going to call it child sexual abuse material, but in the law, that's what it's stated as, was defined in 1982 over the concern of the Ferber case. Paul Ferber was an owner of an adult bookstore who sold 2 films of boys performing sexual acts to an undercover police officer, and he was arrested for violating the obscenity laws of the state of New York. But his appeal was made with the First Amendment freedom of speech and state that his conviction didn't meet the standards for the obscenity law. However, the case was eventually appealed to the Supreme Court and his conviction was upheld, with the court deciding that child pornography, because of its damaging nature to the children involved in its production and the psychological damage it does to the child knowing the pornography is being distributed, can be banned, even if it did not mean the definition of obscenity. The opinion reads, "The test for child pornography is separate from the obscenity standard enunciated in Miller, but may be compared to it for the purpose of clarity. The Miller formation is adjusted in the following respects. A trier of fact need not find that the material appeals to the prurient interests of the average person. It is not required that sexual conduct portrayed be done so in a patently offensive manner, and the material issue need not be considered as a whole." And in 1996, the US Congress passed the Child Pornography Protection Act, which gave the US government a lot more help in the ownership, distribution and sales of CSAM. The whole reason this was created in the first place was because of the worrying rise of computer sharing and image sharing and the rise of harm that might cause online. The CPP defined child pornography as any visual depiction including any photograph, film, video, picture or computer generated image of picture, whether made or produced by electronic, mechanical or other means of sexual explicit conduct where such visual depiction is or appears to be of a minor engaging in sexually explicit conduct. What I want to make note here is that on the definition they included appears to be but need not be of real children. However, following the passing of the CPPA, People in the adult entertainment industry sued the federal government on the grounds that the CPPA's words, such as appears to be, and conveys the impression, were way too vague and overreaching into areas of protected speech. The case was eventually brought to the Supreme Court, and the CPPA was found unconstitutional and overturned because of the vagueness of the above sections. It was also found that the CPPA was not in compliance with Miller, having no prescribed definitions of what obscenity was. And in response to the overturning of the CPPA, the US Congress passed into law the Protect Act of 2003. The act included a line that only obscene material can be banned, thus reinstating the Miller test, described the various sexual acts that can be used by a court to establish if a work is obscene, and reiterated that a work must lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific merit. The Act also makes explicit two conditions. First, that child pornography can be a visual depiction of any kind, including a drawing, cartoon, sculpture, or painting. Second, that it is not a required element of any offence under the section that the minor depicted actually exists. Both Dwight Horley and Christopher S. Hanley were convicted under this section of the law. In Japan, the claim that loli content is obscene and subject to Japanese legal restrictions stems from Article 175 of the 1907 Criminal Code, which governs the distribution of obscene material. It states a person who distributes, sells, or displays in public an obscene document, drawing, or other object shall be punished by imprisonment with work for not more than 2 years, a fine of not more than 2,500,000 yen, or a petty fine. The same shall apply to a person who possesses the same for the purpose of sale. The code, however, has no definition for the word obscene and just leaves it into interpretation of the Japanese courts. And as of yet, only one manga has ever been prosecuted under this. In recent years, there have been many attempts from local governments of Japan to restrict the availability of content involving minors in a sexual manner. In March of 2006, Osaka Prefecture implemented its Harmful Books Act, aimed at limiting access to shoujo manga of children under 18. In the same year, the National Police Agency published a report calling for tighter controls of products that contain depiction of sexual activities involving children under 13. This age is based around the age of consent in Japan, which was established in the 1907 Penal Code, although this is generally overruled by local governments, which makes the normal age of consent varying from about 16 to 18 years old. And in 2007, the Kyoto Prefectural government named 13 lolicon books as harmful content and required them to have warning labels on them. However, a ban was not implemented as it could be seen as an unconstitutional under the freedom of press. But in 2010, the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly really attempted to tighten these regulations, but despite the support of the at the time ruling Democratic Party, the bill failed to pass. But on that same year, a second attempt was made, and on my birthday, December 17th, it became illegal for under 18s to purchase this kind of manga content. But it's important to note that none of these are aimed at banning the content altogether, but rather the ease of access to obtain the content. However, the violent and graphic sexualized content of some Japanese media, including particularly ones involving seemingly minor characters, has been questioned by countries like the UK, New Zealand, Australia, where fictional depictions of children have now been included in the definition of child abuse publications. The first argument for banning this kind of manga content is the claim that it directly harms individuals and therefore the bans are justified. However, because there is no real children involved and direct harm caused, it's kind of hard to make that claim, which is also a claim that some people make regarding real CSAM, which is a whole other thing. However, instead, the link is more so created between consuming the material and the link to see if there's any crossover there. But a study of pornographic material in Japan in the period between 1972 to 1995 showed an increase in its availability, during which time the number of sexual assaults decreased. The study labelled a myth the assertion that the widespread availability of sexually explicit materials leads to rape, and this finding mirrors a common problem in the larger pornography debate, establishing that pornographic material causes sexual crimes, even if a clear statistical correlation were to exist. But it's not clear that pornographic material would cause an ordinary person to commit sexual crimes, and if an individual has an existing predisposition to commit sexual crimes, then the material can't be blamed as the sole cause of the acts. And these findings are challenging to the widespread assumption that this material gives rise to any direct harm in the form of child abuse. And so since there's no real children being harmed and no apparent link between the two, it's hard to say that it does cause harm. However, this is only regarding the sole ownership and consumption of lolicon media, not including elements such as online forum discussions and a community surrounding it, which is a large portion of what lolicon is. A study created by Sarah Brown from the University of the West of England found that a study of individuals who were searching for CSAM injuries self-reported, keyword here, self-reported, just the ones that admitted it, that their likelihood of seeking out real contact with children after viewing the images was higher in those who viewed it more frequently, viewed material containing toddlers and infants, and were in contact with others also viewing the material. Another study from the same document found that males who were convicted on CSAM charges could be at increased risk of committing further offences if they had participated in online communities. And you're probably like, yeah, but Jade, this is about loli content, not real children. Where's the correlation? And let me introduce you to All the Fallen, which I mentioned beforehand, and I mentioned in another video, and they're going to come for me for this one again, but start with, before I go into it, the lolicon wiki page has a little thing at the bottom that I just want to read out for a minute. Culture and media scholars responding to lolicon generally identify it as distinct from attraction to real young girls. Cultural anthropologist Patrick thinks that from early writings to the present, researchers suggest that lolicon artists are playing with symbols and working with tropes, which does not reflect or contribute to sexual pathology or crime. Psychologist Tamaki Sato, who has conducted clinical work with otaku, highlights an estrangement of lolicon desires from reality as part of a distinction for otaku between textual and actual sexuality, and observes that the vast majority of otaku are not paedophiles in real life. Manga researcher Yukari Fujimoto argues that lolicon desire is not for a child but for the image itself, and that this is understood by those brought up in Japan's culture of drawing and fantasy. Sociologist Mark McClelland identifies lolicon and yaoi as self-consensually anti-realist genres, given a reflection of fans and creators of three-dimensionality in favour of two-dimensionality, and compares lolicon to the yaoi fandom, in which fans consume depictions of homosexuality which lack any correspondent in the real world. ATF would love to discredit this, with one of them in my comment section so blatantly, by the way I made a post about it, you can go check it out, stating that if they did not have access to lolicon mods and drawings and such, that would it be better if they just went out and done it to a real child? And sure, these claims might be true for some, that it is distinct from reality. I'm not discrediting that. However, when we look at these online communities, we can see that a lot, if not most of them, are using it as a placeholder for real children. I was going to show some examples of posts that I saw on ATF, but I don't want to cause any more harm than they're already doing, and I don't want to showcase what they're saying. Also, it's just incredibly triggering, and I don't want to give a platform to it. But you can take my word for it. And also, given that they have a GitHub page, wiki, where you can see that they are making mods and standalone games which involve kidnapping and children, I think yeah, you can take my word on that one. But going off the ATF member claim that a lot of them are using this content to suppress urges, we also know that that's not true. And Chris Matthews would state in the Applied Ethics Journal of 2011 that this claim is flawed for a number of reasons. Firstly, it appears to sanction and even encourage sexual interest in children, even if by proxy, and in doing so it undermines an important and valuable taboo, the widespread condemnation of paedophilic activity or interest. And this taboo serves an important purpose. It deters paedophilic activity and makes anyone susceptible to such desires aware of the unacceptability of their interest. Allowing this material to serve as a proxy for sexual interaction with real children would significantly undermine the force of this taboo, as it requires that we abandon the idea that it is not morally healthy to be sexually interested in minors. Clearly, the safer course of action is to maintain the existing viewpoint that sexual interest in minors is abnormal, unhealthy, and morally unacceptable. Secondly, it also seems to embody a hope that the individual using this material as a proxy never act on their desire, even though they have been given the means to action it, if in limited form. This hope appears dangerous, if not reckless, as it is equally reasonable to believe that use of this material will normalise and embolden the individual's paedophilic tendencies, rather than merely satiating it, thus increasing the risk to real children. Now, this isn't saying that the earlier claim is wrong, that it won't cause a normal individual to commit these crimes. However, it suggests that it would likely be a contributing factor to those with pre-existing sexual desires for children. Also fitting into this little niche is the claim that using AI, CSAM and dolls reduces these urges. However, if that were the case, there would be little to no crossover with those viewing the images and those becoming a contact offender, and it's the opposite, called a crossover offender. A study by the FBP found that 76% of males convicted on CSM charges later would admit to having sexual contact with children. Criminologists have also urged that using these stand-ins don't act as a deterrent for these, as the don't gain any negative feedback from the dolls, so it's only enabling and reinforcing their urges. One example I can give of loli content which is extremely harmful is the works of Kawari Max, which I'm not going to be showing any of his graphic images, and I really don't recommend you look it up yourself. However, I'm going to show some images which are okay to look at, and we can clearly see how young the depictions of these young girls are. But these aren't cute little story. One story depicts a young girl who is sold by her mother to their landlord in order to pay off their rent, and the young girl is kept in a box for years and sexually abused by groups of men. And another story includes a horse, which I'm sure you can put that together yourself. It wasn't until 1999 in which Japan would outlaw the production and distribution of CSAM material, and in 2013 Japan's police agency reported 1,644 offences, which is more than any they had seen since the law came into place in 1999. And in June of 2014 Japan banned the possession of CSAM, and people were given 1 year to comply. Some could argue that this is just due to an increase in population. However, I would argue it's an increase of ease of access to these online communities, including lolicon. Now we can see that going off of previous information, viewing this content just increases the risk. Freedom of speech is a term people love to throw about in these online communities and use as a justification for their actions. However, so many individuals' interpretation of what freedom of speech actually is wrong. But it is the most commonly presented argument in terms of anti-censorship, claiming that restrictions on manga is an infringement of the artist's freedom of speech and expression. The basis of this argument lies in Articles 19 through 2 of the Japanese Constitution, which guarantees certain fundamental individual rights. Article 19, for instance, maintains freedom of thought and conscience shall not be violated, while the key, frequently cited Article 21 is seemingly unambiguous in its free speech provisions, reading, freedom of assembly and association as well as speech, press, and all other forms of expression are guaranteed. No censorship shall be maintained, nor shall the secrecy of any means of communication be violated. And the constitutionally guaranteed right to freedom of speech and expression supporters maintain that it should extend to manga and anime, and that any restrictions violate the artist's freedom of speech, aka their constitutional rights. Although it might seem persuasive, it's wrong, as it's based on the assumption that Article 21 guarantees are absolute and unconstrained by any other considerations. This definition of freedom of speech is both wrong in Japanese legal matter and also social matter, and despite apparent constitutional guarantees to the contrary, Japan does not have unlimited free speech. In fact, there has never been a society in which speech hasn't been limited in some way. As the legislation prohibiting CSAM in Japan, this already shows that Japan has already accepted the need to restrict these materials. And Japan already has numerous laws regarding freedom of speech, such as restricting gambling, requiring pixelizations over pornographic material, and public indecency. All of these show the absolute denial of complete freedom of speech. And any country that applies restrictions to hate speech, false advertising, violent and extreme forms of pornography, or sharing of state secrets, acknowledges that there are circumstances where the interests of free speech need to be balanced against the interests of the public good. The final anti-censorship argument in regards to lolicon is the argument that it may have some sort of educational value and that depictions of sexual activity between minors can be beneficial. Yukari Fujimoto, professor of girls manga and gender at Meiji University, argues that sexually explicit manga assists children in developing their sexuality, allowing them to address and understand their own desires. Protecting children from information regarding sex, she claims, may result in guilt and make them less likely to discuss sexual matters openly. But the educational value defense isn't exactly all that persuasive. While the value of sex education in regards to children isn't to be challenged, the appropriateness of lolicon content is to be questioned. The manga magazine Shukan Shonen Sunday published Small Children, Stories from the Oba Children's Center, a manga about child abuse, and similarly a work written specifically for the purpose of sex education has proven an effective and popular way to discuss issues such as childbirth and puberty. But while these works may be appropriate, lolicon work often contain rape, coercion, incest, paedophilia, and violence as standard themes. They don't depict innocent explorations of sexuality, but rather focus on sensationalized and hyper-real depictions of sexual activities. And it's furthermore presented as simple entertainment with no moral purpose being served. It is as formulaic and predictably sequenced as its counterpart in adult pornographic movies. The works are on the whole clearly motivated and aimed at sexual interests, not educational goals, and the claim that such material possesses educational value is difficult and extreme to uphold. So, what can we garner from all this? Well, ATF members are still weird and wrong, even when they're trying to cite articles. And those promoting lolicon and catering towards it, like, dare I say, Belle Delphine. I don't even have to go into her. You all know who that is. They're enablers, and if you even had to use this video to question that, and stop using freedom of speech as an argument, because you're weird and you're wrong. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. If you have any other information, please let me know. If you don't agree with me, please don't let me know. I'm kidding, but I also don't care. Okay, bye. Mwah.